Hey everybody, and welcome to the last set of videos from Unit 3. Now that we've discussed different types of financial institutions, we're going to move on and close with the discussion on financial crises and how these crises are regulated. So specifically, we're going to be talking in this video about the origins of financial crises. We're going to go over the fragility that exists in the commercial banking industry. Then we're going to talk about government intervention to try and prevent bank panics. And then finally, we're going to close with looking at the relationship between bank panics and recessions. So, let's formally define what a financial crisis is. And it's just a situation where problems in the financial system result in a significant disruption in the low flow of funds from lenders to borrowers. So really the important key is this flow of funds. That's what separates a financial crisis from just another type of problem. And we're going to be using the term insolvent a lot in these next few videos, so it's important you understand what it means. It's just when a bank or any other firm has a negative net worth. And if you remember back from our discussion on the balance sheet, a net worth is just assets minus liabilities. That means that if a bank is insolvent, their liabilities are greater than their assets. And it's also important to remember that banks are extremely illiquid since depositors can demand their money back at any time, but it may be a lot more difficult for them to sell loans that they've issued to raise cash to pay off the depositors demanding their money, which means that bank runs always pose a risk to commercial banks because a bank run would suddenly cause a bank to become insolvent. And when a bank run starts to spread from just an individual bank to a wider sector, we call that a contagion. Just like with any sort of contagious disease, it just means that bad news is spreading from bank to bank, causing bank runs. And because of the contagious effect that bad news has, bank runs are rarely isolated. You never hear of just individual bank runs occurring. And really what that means is we can end up having what we call a bank panic, which is when multiple banks are experiencing bank runs at the same time. And these are a big problem for everybody in the economy, and so the government actively tries to intervene to stop bank panics. And the reason why banks are so important are because of everything that we've talked about through the class. They reduce information costs, they reduce transaction costs, and they also boost liquidity availability in the economy, increasing in turn economic growth. Now, uh, when a bank fails, it doesn't happen in a bubble. It has real world effects. One of the biggest concerns for the government is that when a healthy bank fails just due to liquidity problems, not because of some other in like speculative investing that is causing them to be insolvent, it hurts the ability of a household and small business to obtain loans and to fuel economic growth. And it's a little bit of a moral gray area because if they're only insolvent because of a bank run occurring and a bank panic, it's hard to blame a bank for another bank's bad actions causing it to receive a bank run, which is why the government intervenes as a lender of last resort. And this is just a Fed designation to act as the ultimate source of credit to the banking system. And with commercial banks, we usually see the Fed acting as a lender of last resort to otherwise healthy banks that are experiencing some sort of bank run. So we're not thinking of the Fed just giving out loans left and right every single time a bank makes a bad investment. They're really targeting just healthy banks that have some sort of short term, temporary liquidity crisis. And because of the fact that bank runs can have, these bank panics have a very strong correlation with recessions. In fact, if you look at the list in front of you of bank runs up until the Great Depression, every single bank run is associated with a recession, except for two that existed during the Civil War, which obviously was a slightly different circumstance. So That means that there's a very tight relationship between bank runs and bank panics and recessions, which means that it's of the utmost interest of the US government to try and prevent bank panics from occurring. Additionally, just in general, financial stability is quite important, and the 2007 financial crisis showed this. Now, the financial crisis in 2007 was a little bit different because it wasn't sourced in commercial banks, it was sourced in investment banks, which means that uh, provisions such as being a lender of last resort don't necessarily apply to investment banks, meaning it was more difficult for the Fed to help out these investment banks. However, the result was the same as any severe recession. As you can see in the table in front of you, the average post-war recession was just under a year, led to about 1.7% decline in real GDP, and usually see a peak unemployment rate of about 7.6%. The Great Depression and the financial crisis were by far the two worst, except for the COVID recession, which is a little bit different again. But you can see that the financial crisis lasted a year and a half, saw 4.1% decline in real GDP, and peaked unemployment at 10%. But that still pales in comparison to the Great Depression when we're talking about the scope, the breadth, and the magnitude of the effect that the Great Depression had on the United States. And another important lesson from this is that recessions that follow bank panics are usually a lot more serious than when a bank panic occurs during a recession. And the Great Depression and the financial crisis are the two best examples of this. The financial crisis was a bank run in investment banking, and the Great Depression was a bank run in commercial banking. And these two, as I mentioned, by far the worst recessions in the modern US history. Now, before we close this discussion, there are a couple more types of financial crises that are worth mentioning, and these specifically deal with international issues. The first is an exchange rate crisis. Uh, and what we see, especially in developing countries, is that countries will try and do what we call pegging their currency against another currency, and most of the time it's using the US dollar. So, one great example of this is in Korea. They try to peg their currency with the US dollar, and the reason for that is because it increases the attractiveness of international trade to try and boost the economy because it limits exposure to currency exchange risk. So, the, for companies that want to invest in both industries, it is quite appealing. However, there are a lot of problems with trying to peg. In particular, it may lead to extremely tight cash control and inevitably lead to extremely high interest rates. And the idea with high interest rates is that they make domestic bonds more appealing so that investors will demand the bond and preserve the peg by increasing demand for, in turn, the currency. However, the problem is that it discourages new domestic investment. And we've seen this several times in the past where countries trying to peg against the US dollar end up going into a recession because they can't keep pace with the dollar's strength. Now, on the flip side, we have what we call sovereign debt crises. And this is just when a country's central bank has problems repaying an extensive debt that it issues through bonds. And there's usually two ways that sovereign debt crises end. First are massive unsustainable deficits where the interest payments just make up too large of a fraction of government spending to be sustainable, or we just see a massive recession that reduces tax income and furthers the deficit even more. So, the most popular example of a sovereign debt crisis in a modern economy is what we saw in Greece, where their massive debt was a huge burden to the entire Eurozone or countries that use the euro, and they almost kicked Greece out because of Greece's deficit and sovereign debt crisis being such a burden on the euro. And what ended up happening is severe measures to reduce Greek government spending and dramatically increase taxes in the country of Greece. And so when you hear about uncontrolled debt and deficit spending, this is usually the big problem is a sovereign debt crisis.